Hello, and welcome to the Psychopathology unit for Year 1 in Psychology with Mrs. Scorer. Hi!
And Miss Abbott, hello.
When someone's behaviour is considered abnormal, it is generally because their behaviour noticeably differs from the behaviour expected by society in which it occurs. Every society has an idea of what constitutes normal behaviour, and this idea of what is considered normal and abnormal is constantly changing. Over time, our understanding about nature and the causes of mental illness and what should be done has radically changed. To be able to define abnormality according to our 4 criteria, you're going to be looking at these 4 different definitions. So by the end of this lesson, you should be able to know what 2 of those are and to be able to know how you would classify someone and then evaluate these definitions as well. So the first one that we will be looking at is deviation from social norms. Now, a norm is an expected form of behaviour. So all societies will have them, and they are an important part of the glue that holds a society together. If everyone follows these rules, then interactions between people become regulated and easier, and social living feels altogether more safe and predictable. These standards are often in place for good reasons. An example of a social norm is politeness. People who are rude or surly are considered to be behaving in a socially deviant way because others find it difficult to interact with them. Some rules about unacceptable behaviour are implicit, whereas others are policed by the law. For example, not laughing at a funeral is an implicit social rule, whereas causing a disorder in public is both a deviation from social norms and against the law. Now, deviation from social norms defines abnormal behaviour as what deviates from the social norm. So the implicit standards of acceptable behaviour that are set by the social group and adhered by that group, the people within that group. So deviation from the rules regulating how one should behave are seen as undesirable or antisocial by the majority of society's members. So some real life examples for you. In the past, homosexuality was classified as abnormal and regarded as a mental disorder. It was also against the law in the UK, obviously not nowadays. This judgment was based on social deviation. It was a judgment made by society at the time. Other forms of sexual behaviour continue to be classified as abnormal, such as paedophilia. Now, the reason that such behaviours were judged as abnormal is because they deviate from social norms of what is acceptable. A few other examples are a person who has OCD who washes their hand 50 times a day, or a person who is constantly aggressive towards others. So, is all behaviour that deviates from a social norm abnormal, and why not? So some questions for you to consider when we come to evaluating deviation from social norms. Is it a stable definition over time? Does it have cross-cultural validity? Can you remember that definition of validity that we looked at last term? Can the definition be abused? Is deviant behaviour always abnormal? Okay, so we've looked at the deviation from social norms definition. Now we need to look at some AO3 evaluation points. Now the first point to make is that it's susceptible to abuse. So the main difficulty with this definition is that it varies as times change. So what is socially acceptable now may not have been in the past, say 50 years ago. For example, today homosexuality is acceptable, but in the past it was included under sexual and gender identity disorders. Same as 50 years ago in Russia, anyone who disagreed with the state ran the risk of being regarded as insane and placed in a mental institution. So if we define abnormality in terms of deviation from social norms, we open the door to definitions based on prevailing social morals and attitudes. This then allows mental health professionals to classify as mentally ill those people who transgress against social attitudes or a way to possibly exclude non-conformists from society. Now, a second evaluation point is that deviation is related to context and degree. So making judgments on deviance is often related to the context of a behaviour. So if you come in tomorrow and you're wearing a bikini to school, we might be thinking that's a little bit odd. But if you were on a beach and that actually happened, that would be regarded as fine. Such as shouting loudly and persistently is deviant behaviour, but evidence of a mental disturbance is not necessarily there unless it's excessive, and even then it might not be a mental disorder. So what this means is that social deviance on its own cannot offer a complete definition of abnormality, because it is inevitably related to both the context and the degree. Another point that you can talk about is cultural relativism. So walking around Maidstone naked would be seen as a deviation from social norms and therefore abnormal, but walking around the Amazonian rainforest in professional suits would also be a deviation from the social norm and regarded as abnormal. So you do have to take into account cultural values when you come to look at deviation from social norms. There are some strengths. On the positive side, this definition does distinguish between desirable and undesirable behaviour, and this was absent from the statistical infrequency model, which we will look at tomorrow. The social deviancy model also takes into account the effect that behaviour has on others, and deviance is defined in terms of transgression of social rules, and social rules are established in order to help people live together. So according to this definition, abnormal behaviour is behaviour that damages others.
Moving on to our next definition, which is a failure to function adequately. Now, everyday life brings with it collections of demands and mundane requirements. For example, the majority of adults need to earn an income. This requires them to get up in the morning, get dressed, and go to work. Relationships with others have to be managed and their emotional and other needs met. When someone's behaviour suggests that they cannot cope with these everyday demands, then they run the risk of being labelled abnormal. They are failing to function adequately. This is often a clear sign of psychopathology that something is wrong. Someone who is depressed, for example, may fail to get up in the morning and have difficulties in their relationships with family and friends, and therefore, again, they are failing to function adequately. Now, the definition you need to know is that abnormal behaviour is judged in terms of being able to function adequately and to cope with day-to-day life. If behaviour interferes with this basic ability to function adequately, then one is considered abnormal, according to this definition. Rose and Hannon Seligman in 1989 suggested the following features of behaviour that indicate whether or not a person is failing to function adequately. Observer discomfort. This is when another's behaviour causes discomfort and distress to the observer. Unpredictability. We rely on the behaviour of people around us to be unpredictable, so when behaviour appears unpredictable and uncontrolled, it leads us to think that there is something wrong. Irrationality is when we can usually interpret the behaviour of others as being rational, but sometimes behaviours look irrational and hard to understand. Maladaptiveness. This is when a behaviour is maladaptive. It hinders the ability of a person to adjust to a particular situation. For example, if someone has very extreme shyness, this behaviour might be maladaptive in situations which require them to interact effectively with other people. And the last one, personal suffering and distress. This is when failure to cope with everyday life causes personal distress or suffering to the individual.